I want you to take a second and just think about your to-do list right now.
Oh boy, that's a scary thought.
Right. Just picture it. Because if you're anything like me or honestly anyone trying to navigate the modern world, you probably know that familiar creeping sensation of being completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, totally.
We are just constantly buried under tasks, performance metrics, and this relentless, heavy pressure to just produce results. It's an exhausting way to live.
It really is.
And it's especially draining if you're in any kind of leadership role or management or ministry where the stakes always feel incredibly high and everyone is looking to you for direction.
Well, it's a profound modern problem. We've essentially built our entire organizational structures and, frankly, our personal lives around the deeply ingrained idea that our output equals our intrinsic value.
Exactly. We have to prove our worth.
Right. We track our steps, we measure our productivity, we monitor our quarterly growth, and yet despite all this data proving how much we do, we often end up feeling completely depleted at the end of the day.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today.
Yeah.
Welcome to the deep dive. We have a really fascinating piece of source material in front of us.
We do.
It's a comprehensive manuscript titled The Task Before Us and the Grace That Carries Us. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore a truly radical paradigm shift that the author proposes.
A very necessary shift, I might add.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Because instead of obsessing over how we can efficiently finish all the tasks on our plates, the manuscript asks a completely different question. It asks, who are we actually becoming while we're trying to get it all done?
It completely flips the script.
It does. We're going to unpack how shifting from a task-driven identity to a presence-driven identity can fundamentally alter everything, from your daily stress levels to the long-term legacy you leave behind.
It's a brilliant pivot in perspective, and to set the stage properly, I think it's worth clarifying that while this manuscript is written primarily for the Christian church, and it focuses on the theology of the Great Commission, the insights it offers into human systems and organizational behavior are universally compelling.
Yeah, you don't have to be leading a church to get something out of this.
Not at all. The author dives deep into the architecture of burnout, the psychological toll of leadership isolation, and the inherent dangers of measuring success solely by institutional expansion.
Which applies to literally any organization.
Exactly. And just to be clear, we aren't here to endorse a specific theology or preach a particular worldview. We're just here to impartially explore the ideas within this framework. Because whether you're leading a congregation, running a tech startup, or managing a household, the psychological insights here about human limits are incredibly relevant to you.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So to kick things off, the author paints a picture that is just, well, it's so vivid. I think anyone who has ever sat on a committee or a board will instantly recognize it.
Oh, the whiteboard story.
Yes. Okay, so imagine a church leadership team sitting in a brightly lit conference room. It's late on a Sunday evening.
Everyone is exhausted.
Right. There are probably half-empty pizza boxes on the table, everyone looks a little sleep-deprived, and the giant whiteboard at the front of the room is absolutely, completely covered in ink.
Just a wall of tasks.
A massive wall. We're talking plans for massive outreach events, new youth initiatives, complex social media strategies, a sprawling community feeding program. The works.
And on paper, they are thriving.
Exactly. If you look at this organization on paper, they are scaling up. But beneath the surface, it's a totally different reality.
Right. The institutional machinery is humming along, but the humans running it are breaking down.
Breaking down completely. Volunteers are quietly stepping down because they feel like cogs in a machine. Staff members are teetering on the edge of clinical exhaustion. The prayer meetings and times of quiet reflection are virtually empty, while the strategy and activity meetings are just packed to the brim with stressed-out people.
That image of the full whiteboard is such a striking metaphor for our current cultural moment. All that frantic activity is essentially masking an underlying structural erosion. And in the story they share, the tension in that room finally breaks when one of the older leaders asks an incredibly disruptive question. He just looks at this sprawling mess on the board, sighs, and asks, "Why does it feel like we're doing more for Jesus than walking with him?"
Man, that question just hits you right in the chest.
It really does.
But, my immediate reaction to that is actually a bit defensive. I mean, that sounds profound and poetic, but Practically speaking, organizations need programs, right?
Sure they do.
The work still has to get done. You can't just sit around and expect a community feeding program to organize itself.
Well, what's fascinating here is how the author breaks down the core theological and psychological argument behind that specific type of exhaustion. The modern industrialized world fundamentally defines our worth by our performance. You meet someone at a dinner party, and the very first question is almost always, "So what do you do?"
Every single time.
But this manuscript argues that the biblical pattern, the framework this theology is built on, operates in the exact opposite direction. Within this paradigm, God establishes identity before assigning any responsibility.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So, the author points to the historical narrative in the book of Exodus. They note that God calls the people of Israel his treasured possession entirely up front before he ever hands down a single commandment or a single task.
Ah, nice.
The foundational idea is that identity precedes mission. You are valued first, and you work from that established place of value. When we reverse that equation, when we frantically try to work in order to secure our identity or prove our work inevitably becomes heavy, frantic, and ultimately unsustainable.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at the organic metaphor the author uses from the Gospel of John to illustrate this. They bring up the imagery of the vine and the branches.
Yes, that's a beautiful section.
It really is. And the author points out something that is, honestly, pretty funny but deeply true. Think about an actual vineyard. Branches don't strain.
No, they don't.
They don't sweat. They don't stress out or organize massive weekend-long conferences on innovative fruit-bearing techniques.
They just sit there.
Exactly. All they literally do is stay connected to the vine. The manuscript's argument is that fruit or productive output is supposed to be the natural overflow of intimacy and connection, not the result of frantic, isolated effort.
It completely reorients our modern concept of productivity. The text argues that within the spiritual framework, followers aren't actually commanded to manufacture fruit. They are simply commanded to remain connected.
Which sounds so much easier, but in practice we fight it.
We do fight it because when a leader or an entire organization substitutes busyness for that core connection, the inevitable result is burnout cleverly disguised as faithfulness. And the author grounds this in a very relatable real-world example to pull it out of the abstract. They share the story of a woman named Maria.
Yes, Maria's story is so telling. She's a ministry leader who was coordinating an impossible number of outreach events, multiple weekly Bible studies, and managing teams of volunteers.
A real go-getter.
By every external metric, she was a rock star. She was incredibly productive. But she confessed privately to a mentor that she honestly couldn't remember the last time she just sat quietly with her faith without simultaneously preparing a lesson plan or organizing a schedule.
Wow.
She was doing all this stuff for her beliefs, but she was completely disconnected from the actual source of them.
And the turning point for her is fascinating. She ended up going on a silent retreat, which, for someone addicted to productivity, is basically a forced detox.
I would lose my mind on a silent retreat.
It's hard. She had no agenda, no phone, no meetings to run. And it was there she realized she had completely substituted activity for intimacy. Her entire sense of self was tied up in being the person who got things done.
And what's wild is what happened when she went back to her normal life. She started making her quiet mornings absolute non-negotiable. She actually started saying no to new tasks and letting some of the less vital programs sunset.
Which is terrifying for a leader.
It is. You'd think, based on corporate logic, that her ministry would just collapse. But it didn't. It actually flourished. Because she wasn't running on fumes anymore, her volunteers felt energized instead of pressured, and her conversations with people actually had depth.
It's a perfect case study for the author's main point. You simply cannot sustain what you do if you forget who you are.
Exactly.
Which perfectly transitions us into the whole concept of metrics, how we actually evaluate our lives and our organizations. Because Maria's initial trap was that she was evaluating her success based purely on the sheer volume of her activities.
We have to talk about the metrics.
Yeah.
We live in a society that absolutely worships the dashboard.
Oh, completely.
Everything has a graph. We're obsessed with tracking attendance numbers, quarter-over-quarter budget growth, engagement rates, follower counts. If we can't quantify it on a spreadsheet, we basically assume it doesn't exist.
We really do. And the manuscript offers a remarkably sharp critique of this modern metric obsession. The author argues that when numerical growth replaces character formation as the ultimate benchmark of success, a very predictable and dangerous pattern emerges.
What happens?
The programs expand, but actual meaningful human presence shrinks. The production quality of the events goes through the roof, but the depth of the relationships hits rock bottom. The text makes a rather profound assertion here. It claims that the kingdom of God, or any truly healthy community for that matter, doesn't run on analytics. It runs on faithfulness.
To really drive that home, the author presents this incredibly provocative scenario that I think would make any modern CEO or board member sweat.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
Imagine a growing, dynamic organization, in this case a church that has been seeing year-over-year growth. Suddenly they hit a plateau. Attendance stops climbing.
Yeah.
The budget flatlines. Naturally, absolute panic sets in.
Cue the consultants.
Right. They bring in outside consultants, they hold emergency meetings, they start strategizing even harder to get the numbers moving up and to the right again.
Right.
But during a tense leadership retreat, one of the elders asks another one of those show-stopping questions.
What does he ask?
He looks at the panicked team and asks, if our numbers stayed exactly where they are right now for the next 5 years, but every single member of this community actually became more compassionate, more patient, and more like Christ, would we consider that a success?
It's a brilliant question because it exposes the underlying business model that has quietly hijacked the mission.
Right, because honestly, if you asked most modern organizations that question, the unspoken answer would be no.
Definitely no.
They'd say you're stagnating. If the line on the graph isn't going up, you're failing.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, history consistently proves that enduring movements operate on a different timeline entirely. The author points out that historical movements that actually lasted over centuries, they use the example of the Moravian prayer movement, didn't prioritize massive, immediate visibility or spectacle.
What do they prioritize?
They prioritized sustained, quiet prayer and personal integrity over rapid expansion. So this framework really challenges you to think about what the author calls obedience metrics.
Obedience metrics. I like that.
It asks what it would actually look like if you redesigned your personal dashboard. What if, instead of tracking your visibility, your output, or your social reach, your dashboard tracked hidden acts of service? What if it measured restored relationships or moments of quiet integrity in your workplace where you chose the harder, more honest path?
I love that phrase, obedience metrics. It completely flips the definition of success on its head. But there's another major trap the text warns about when we try to implement these ideas, and it's something our culture is incredibly guilty of perpetuating.
The lone hero myth.
Yes, the myth of the lone hero. We absolutely love to celebrate the dynamic, isolated founder. We write magazine profiles about the solitary genius who builds an empire out of a garage all by themselves. But the source material insists that within this theological framework, God's mission never, ever thrives in isolation.
That highly individualistic mindset is so deeply ingrained in Western culture, but the manuscript presents a contrasting vision of a deeply interdependent community. It relies heavily on the metaphor of a human body or a symphony.
Right, like an eye can't do the job of a hand.
Exactly. An eye cannot function effectively without a hand. A single violin doesn't make a symphony. The author argues that when leaders try to operate in heroic isolation, it inevitably breeds burnout. Furthermore, it creates massive organizational blind spots and fragments resources.
Because everyone is just building their own little kingdom.
Precisely. The core argument here is that operating in isolation actually contradicts the very nature of the divine, as presented in this theology. Unified obedience, rather than solitary achievement, is what truly reflects the character of God.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the author doesn't just leave this as a nice philosophical idea. They ground it in a gritty, real-world story about a highly divided industrial city.
This was a powerful example.
It really was. The pastors and community leaders in this city were separated by decades of friction. We're talking economic divides, deep-seated denominational rivalries, and historical wounds across different neighborhoods. For years, they were essentially functioning as competitors in a spiritual marketplace.
Vying for the same people.
Exactly. All vying for the same attendees and the same limited resources. But eventually, the exhaustion of competing caught up with them. A small group of them decided to stop strategizing against each other and simply committed to getting in a room to pray for their city together.
And the psychological shift required to do that cannot be overstated. You're asking leaders to lay down their egos, their branding, and their proprietary strategies.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
But over time, sitting in that room together built actual trust. And from that foundation of trust, they started pooling their resources. Instead of 5 churches running 5 underfunded, mediocre food pantries, they collaborated on a massive flood relief effort when a crisis hit.
They finally had the numbers to make a real impact.
Right. They combined their budgets to create shared youth mentorship programs that actually had the scale to make a difference.
And the outcomes they saw in the community were staggering.
They really were. According to the text, the crime rates in the neighborhoods where they focused these unified efforts actually began to decline. It was so noticeable that local civic leaders and city officials started reaching out to consult with them on community development.
That's amazing.
But the absolute most crucial part of this story, the thing that really brings the author's point home, not a single church claimed ownership of the success. No one put their specific logo on the mentorship program to boost their own attendance metrics. They let the credit go, and that is the true power of unified obedience.
It's a phenomenal example of how isolation inherently weakens us while unity fortifies us. And this idea of taking the focus off of our own branding transitions beautifully into how the manuscript redefines another heavily loaded concept.
Evangelism.
Yes, evangelism, or the act of bearing witness. This raises an important question. How do we actually view our mundane daily interactions?
Right.
The author argues quite forcefully that sharing one's faith or bearing witness to one's core values should never be driven by pressure, a sense of guilt, or a frantic anxiety to close a deal. It's not a quota you have to hit. It should be a natural, unforced overflow of a transformed life.
Which is such a massive relief. It completely takes the pressure off. You don't need a stadium, a massive social media platform, or a microphone to make a legitimate impact. The text highlights that the most profound testimonies often happen in the most mundane, ordinary settings imaginable.
Like the story of Daniel.
Yes, Daniel. They give this great example of a guy named Daniel. He's an engineer working in a bustling, high-stress corporate office. Now, Daniel didn't stand up on his desk in the middle of the bullpen and start preaching to his coworkers. Instead, his witness was his quiet, unshakable, ethical integrity.
Right, it was in the mechanics of how he lived his everyday life.
Exactly. When the quarterly numbers looked bad and managers suggested cutting corners, Daniel politely but firmly refused. When massive layoffs hit and the office became a toxic soup of panic and gossip, Daniel remained calm and compassionate. He just did his job well and treated people with dignity.
That really stands out in a corporate environment.
It does. And that quiet, consistent integrity in a high-pressure environment naturally made his coworkers incredibly curious. They started approaching him by the coffee machine, asking how he stayed so grounded. And that simple curiosity organically opened the door for deep, authentic conversations that no forced presentation ever could have achieved.
It's a perfect illustration. The text also points to the historical example of Lydia in the Book of Acts. She was a successful businesswoman dealing in luxury purple cloth. Her impact wasn't rooted in formal theological debates in the public square.
What was it rooted in?
It was rooted in her everyday resources and her practice of hospitality. She simply opened her home, and her living room essentially became the foundational gathering place for a brand new community. She used what she had right where she was.
It's the sacredness of the ordinary. We tend to think we need to escape our normal lives to do something important, but the important stuff is happening right where we are.
It truly is. If you think about your own routine, your morning commute, your desk at work, your family dinner table, we often view these everyday moments as annoying interruptions to the quote-unquote real work or the real mission we're supposed to be accomplishing.
Like we just need to get through the day to get to the important stuff.
Exactly. But the framework presented in this manuscript argues that these ordinary moments aren't interruptions to the arena, they are the arena. Extraordinary outcomes don't usually come from spectacular, highly produced events. They emerge from a long obedience in the same direction, from ordinary, everyday faithfulness.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If we take all these complex concepts we've talked about today, the exhaustion of the full whiteboard, the trap of prioritizing dashboards over character, the destructive myth of the lone hero, and the profound power of an ordinary witness, and we distill them down, the ultimate message of this text is pretty clear.
Identity must precede activity.
Exactly. Identity must precede activity. Whether you are leading a massive global organization, managing a local team, or just trying to navigate your daily commute without losing your mind, the most important metric isn't how much you are frantically producing. The most important metric is how faithfully you are aligning your life with who you were fundamentally created to be.
Perfectionism and metric obsession ultimately seek control, but alignment seeks communion. Our modern world is always going to celebrate flash, speed, and massive scale. It's baked into our economy.
It really is.
But according to the deep wisdom in this text, true, enduring legacy is built on steadiness, on surrender, and on remaining deeply connected to the source of your values. The ultimate mission, whatever it may be in your life, doesn't rely on your frantic, exhausting activity. It relies on your steady, faithful presence.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought drawn directly from the hidden insights of this manuscript. It's an idea we haven't touched on yet today, but it's incredibly powerful and challenging.
I think I know what you're going to say.
The Legacy Journal.
Yes, the legacy journal.
The author proposes this exercise. Here is the challenge. Imagine keeping a journal for the next entire year, but there is a strict rule. You are completely banned from recording any visible achievements, any numerical metrics, or any public accolades.
That sounds tough.
You cannot write down your promotions, your sales numbers, or your social media follower counts. Instead, you're only allowed to record the hidden seeds you have planted. A quiet conversation that genuinely encouraged a colleague. A moment of integrity in the office that actually cost you something. An unanswered prayer or a difficult hope that you are still faithfully holding on to in the dark.
It's a complete shift in what we value.
It is. Ponder that for a moment. If you only measured your unseen obedience, how would it change the way you view your success tomorrow?
It is a profound shift in perspective. Thank you for walking through this material with us. We hope it has challenged you to think differently about your identity and the way you approach your daily tasks.
We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.